Hello class, this is Jiasheng Liu, and I'm talking in response to the discussion week 7 on link 46 psycholinguistics about second language acquisition. So as a speaker of 6 languages, I went through 5 second language acquisitions outside of that of my mother tongue, which is Mandarin. And some people call me talented in language learning, but I really do not think so. I have tried using, Bilingual, using Rosetta Stone, Memrise, you name it, all of those companies that provide service for, adult language learning, and I do so mostly to pick up a few languages that aren't available or aren't as accessible around the Monterey Peninsula. So for example, I tried Russian, I tried Modern Greek, I tried Tibetan, etc. on these providers, but none of that really worked out. And there are people saying, hey, I know you speak Portuguese and Spanish, and the reason why you speak both of these languages so well is because, one really helped the other. I think maybe that, that is partially the case. That is partially how I, diminished the amount of effort and travail required to reach certain level of proficiency. But it's not like I'm starting from scratch for some of the languages that I tried on these mobile apps. See, I tried Greek with my previous knowledge on ancient Greek, and I also knew the Indo-European connection. I know a considerable amount of Proto-Indo-European. I have basically a better head start than the vast majority of the Greek students, for if it's the first time that they're learning Greek. However, it just didn't work. My Greek sucked. My Russian sucked, despite, again, it being an Indo-European language. I ended up forgetting all of them. I was basically learning at a speed slower than I forget. So I began to become very curious on what was it that made me capable of learning certain languages fast and certain languages slow. And it doesn't, after this kind of thought, just like what I discussed earlier, I realized it might not necessarily have to do with what language I'm learning, but rather the method through which I learn these languages. So I struggled with English when I came to the United States. I came here at the age of 14. My English was absolutely horrible, and the only other language I could speak was Mandarin, which is my mother tongue. I kept getting 60s for my English papers. It was really frustrating. I thought my papers were splendid. I tried a lot of rhetoric technique that I had experienced or at least experimented when I was a middle schooler in China. My Chinese teacher back in my middle school gave me a lot of positive comments on those kind of techniques that I experimented. And when I tried to implant these into my English writing, I got overwhelmingly negative response. People say it doesn't make any sense, and people just say, I have no idea what you're talking about. So there was once, after I got another like 60 or 70, I forgot how many points I actually scored on that essay, I came to my English teacher's office and I tell her, why is it that my paper keep earning very low grades? It's not like I procrastinated until the very last moment and write a bunch of things that doesn't make any sense. When I read it over, I think it makes perfect sense, and I think the logic's flowing and and the writing's beautiful. But when she looks it over, she said the same thing again. It doesn't make sense. So I tell her, hey, it's really, frustrating for a second language learner to be, hearing all about these. We are trying to translate the ideas that we have in our mind from our original language. In my case, it's Mandarin into English, and I don't know, like I was really frustrated and really thrown off by this kind of "I don't understand" comment. But that's when she said something that totally transformed my career and my dynamic in English classes, and perhaps many of the classes that involve a lot of writing in the future. That is, she told me, you have to stop translating. If I have to write something down in English, I form my thought in Mandarin and I translate that into English and then I put it down. But she told me to stop doing that and directly convert my thoughts into English. Think in English and type in English. To do that, I had to start from the very, very basics. I start writing very simple sentences, much shorter than the ones that I used to write. I start to use very basic vocabularies, and gradually, as the time moves on, I return to the level where I thought I once were, where I was, and then gradually I surpassed the level that I was in my freshman year. So after that, I noticed a big change on people's reception of my writing. They stopped saying doesn't make sense. They actually began to understand my logic, my thoughts, and they start to appreciate the things that I tried, the techniques that I experiment in writings. That was very interesting, and I entered English honors after junior year, something that I could only dream of when I was a freshman, getting 60s in most of the papers. Meanwhile, I also started to do very well in learning of other languages. So I skipped Spanish 1 for my sophomore year. I placed myself into Spanish 2 straight away, and after that I placed myself into Spanish 4 honors without taking Spanish 3. And at the same year, I took national exam for Portuguese. I took the highest level directly, and I got a silver nationally. So that's when people told me, hey, I think you're really talented in languages. And I told them, no. Like, you have no idea how much I struggled with just being a bilingual, just using English effectively 2 years ago. Not to even mention becoming a polyglot. I didn't even know that I was capable of speaking 6 languages by now. Like, a freshman me would have never thought about this possibility. So I have to imagine, like, why? Why was it that all of a sudden I became able to speak so many languages and deploy them with a high level of fluency and proficiency? So then I think my English teacher, by telling me to start thinking English, i.e., to be put in more general terms, to think in the language that you were studying, that you were using, was really the key. But it really wasn't a well-organized thought before this summer. But I didn't know what was going on. Anyway, I think by that point I knew that it will help tremendously if I just think in that language without using the aid of a translation. But I didn't know what really is going on that facilitated this process. So this summer I realized I absolutely need to learn French. There was going to be a placement exam waiting for me last fall, and I had 3 months. I had to learn as much French as I can. Meanwhile, I couldn't sign myself up for a language immersion program because I was involved in a bunch of advanced Latin training, and obviously, as much as Latin would help in French, I knew that most of the will be too busy dealing with Latin rather than French. So I have to use my free time to build up as much French as I could over the summer. So that's what I did. I tried my best to not think in English as I studied French. I set all of my devices to French, and I used a textbook and learning materials that are entirely in French. And that's when I was looking at the introduction, the author of the textbook, who is a professor from Yale University, told us do not use translations. The very thing that my English teacher earlier told me not to do. They say translation often get into your way of thinking, and it ultimately is the very ineffective tool to learn a language. So that's what I attempted. I tried to basically hardwire concepts and mental images with words and expressions in French rather than connecting words and phrases in French into their English equivalents. So with this kind of direct, I wasn't sure how good my French was. It wasn't until when I took the placement test that I realized I really qualified, starting from absolute 0 to French 3 honors, and it was absolutely surprised me. I did not see myself being capable of doing that. I thought I would absolutely fail that exam, but I survived. I made it through. So that worked somehow, like a charm. And so now going back to psycholinguistics and my point of why do I think that we can learn a second language or a third language or an nth language like a baby. So let's look of okay. So let's establish some common ground. We know that the model that babies learn languages is the optimal one. Like when a baby learns their first language, the result is almost always a fluent speaker in that language. Let's be sure about that. And so let's look at the things that babies do when they learn languages that really made their language learning experience optimal. To count on a few. A, it was fully immersive, obviously, because they are basically surrounded by people such as their parents or their close family relatives who basically speak the same language that they will learn ultimately. And B, they did not go through any sort of translation. What they did is they are being taught to speak that language, to think in that language. And they did exactly what my English teacher told me to do, and exactly what I did when I was speaking French. That is to hardwire concepts and mental images to words and phrases in that language, rather than going through a translation. Well, good for the babies, they didn't have any language from where they can translate. So all they can do, if they encounter something that they do not know how to express, it's a sink or swim scenario. They either try to express it in the first language that they're trying to learn, or they stay quiet, right? So knowing these kind of advantage that a baby learner have, we can try to replicate it. But before that, let me justify why translation slows people down. We all know by now that human speech process involves basically 3 major steps. One is lexicalization, the conversion from an abstract idea into words, into content words. And then there's grammaticalization. We put the functional words into the speech so that our sentence becomes grammatically correct. i.e., there are two processes going on. First, we figure out the concrete words that we want to use in our utterance, and then we apply the rules of grammar into this sentence to make it grammatically correct. Then it's vocalization, the last step, which is basically speaking out loud. So let's throw vocalization out of the window right now, because accent and all of that isn't really the topic of this discussion. How does a second language work in your brain is what what we're trying to focus here. I propose two possible scenarios for the speech process of a non-fluent second language. For the absolute beginners, okay, what these people will try is, first, they will lexicalize the abstract ideas in their first language, or whichever language based on which they learn this second language, and then they apply the rules of the first language into these words to make it a complete sentence in the first language. And then they translate the entire phrase word by word into the second language, and then they speak it out loud. That is perhaps the absolute beginner strategy. A little bit more advanced than that, I think, will be conceptualize the words that you're going to use in the first language, translate all of the words into the second language, then apply the rules of the second language directly. So, i.e., lexicalized in the first language and grammaticalized in the second language. But regardless of which process you use, there are more steps involved compared to directly lexicalize ideas in your second language and then grammaticalize it. You save the time of translation. And no matter how fast you translate, no matter how smart you are ultimately less efficient and less natural than someone who's capable of lexicalize and grammaticalize in their second language. So now you're saying, aren't you just trying to make us all be fluent in all languages? No. You can lexicalize and grammaticalize in a second language without being fluent in it. You can do so with very limited language skills. And all of us have once been through that stage. When was that? It's when we were babies. When we were 2 years old, we probably did not have as much of linguistic competence as we have right now. We probably wouldn't be able to read a PhD dissertation. We probably wouldn't have that much vocab. Our utterance probably weren't as complicated and sophisticated as we could have made it right now. But does that mean we use any sort of translations when we were 2 years old? No. This kind of thought, despite the fact that it was limited, it was natural, it was spontaneous, and it was translation-free. So that is what we want to get to. We want this kind of infantile stage of the second language that we're learning. And that is precisely what I inadvertently did for my French learning. I admit that my French is limited by its vocab, and my listening ability is quite low because I don't have as much interaction since I really lack a immersive training with it. But as long as I know the words in French, my fluency is good. Because concepts are being linked directly to their French equivalents rather than going through a medium of English. That's based on the assumption that I do know the French word, which is not always the case. But if I know all of the word in a French sentence, I can speak it out loud without any interruption, without going through English as a medium. And that is what I strive to do for other of my languages. I try to purge concepts of English out of my Spanish and Portuguese to make it more perfect. And I'm seeing great results. I mean, my Spanish was probably involved with some sort of English translations when I was learning it. And right now what I'm trying to do is that I try to purge it as I work towards level CFR, level C1, which is the level of fluency. And the result is surprising. Like, I passed the speaking component of CFR level C1, which is fluent, before I passed any other category. There are many people struggling with speaking in terms of in the CFR training, and I somehow passed the speaking component before I passed anything else. And I think really this infantile stage of the language is the key to higher linguistic competence. And just like I said before, I do not think this is something you need. This is something you need talent to have. We can all skip the stage of translation if we do not install the English to Spanish or English to French dictionary in our phone. If we insist on figuring out the ideas in the target language that we are trying to speak, if we insist on trying our very best to understand the passage in the original language, and trying our best to establish connections with between the ideas and the target language's lexicon. And finally, if we insist ourselves to directly convert our mind, our concepts into that language without using English or any other language as a medium. And as long as we can do that, this is the infantile stage, as I talked about earlier, and that is the basis of a fluent speaker. And if you look into that, none of that requires any sort of talent, right? You do not need to have any sort of talent to uninstall your English to Spanish dictionary, although I do admit that sometimes it is useful if you have absolutely no idea what is going on. But the closer we can get to the model at which babies learn languages, the more effective our studying strategy is. And that goes back to my point, that is, we can replicate the model at which babies study languages. And the degree to which, how we can emulate it, the degree to which, how close we can get to it, only depends on how much we can suppress our thought in our first languages, or the languages that we already know. Human minds are lazy. We use ad hoc methods to try to get away with some kind of complicated or embarrassing situations. However, babies do not have that. If we want to express something extremely complicated, and we do not know how to express that in our second language, what we'll do is we'll either pull out Google Translate or simply look up the words. But babies do not have that. They either have to find out an alternative way, or they stay silent. And that's what I encourage you all to do. Learn it in the authentic way. Learn it in the baby's way. It might be very hard in the very beginning. You might be frustrated to be overwhelmed by the amount of information you have to absorb. But once you get past this stage, your reward will be exponentially more fruitful than if you stick with simply translating concepts from English to another language. Thank you.